Hello everyone. Tonight we will quietly step into the dark corridors of ancient Rome where silent marble statues watch and secrets echo between the walls. Picture the flickering oil lamps stretching trembling shadows. And behind that gilded door, the young Emperor Caligula had turned the palace not only into a throne, but into a stage where divinity and debauchery merged into one. The Romans once hailed him, calling him the Golden Child. But they had no idea what awaited when the cheers ended. If you think stories of emperors are just dry history lessons, trust me, after hearing this, you will wish they truly were. And honestly, if you had stood there among those rituals, perhaps you wouldn't have survived long enough to complain about the scent of incense. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And meanwhile, leave me a comment to let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I really love seeing how our night owl community stretches across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes, try to hear the night wind blowing through the window, and imagine yourself walking on the marble-paved road leading into the Palatine Palace. Outside, Rome sparkles with torches, the murmurs of the people still reminding each other of the golden child of Germanicus. But inside, where the cold marble walls keep every sound sealed, Caligula begins to write a play that would make future generations shiver 1,000 years later. Don't you find it strange? A young man in his 20s, once affectionately called Little Boots by the soldiers who adored him, now had become the one who forced an entire empire to bow in silence. The historical truth is that Caligula ascended the throne in the year 37 after Christ, after the death of the old and reclusive emperor Tiberius. The whole city of Rome then erupted in collective joy. Flowers rained on the streets, veterans wept with happiness. Everyone believed that the young prince would restore the glory of the age of Augustus. But you and I both know, the greater the joy, the longer the shadow of disappointment. Perhaps you have also felt this in your own life. Someone you placed all your hopes in, only to end up teaching you a lesson you never wanted to learn. A strange detail few people know. As a child, Caligula lived in the military camp with his father, the General Germanicus. He was tiny, wore little soldier's boots, and the soldiers affectionately called him the little boy with the small boots. They believed that child would grow up carrying the integrity and courage of his father. But life is never a sweet novel. When Germanicus suddenly died at Antioch, rumors spread that he had been poisoned, and so Caligula, from a pampered child, stepped straight into the snake pit of palace politics. Historians still debate whether Tiberius himself was involved in that death, but in any case, you can imagine how that invisible scar was carved deeply into the heart of a teenage boy. Imagine the scene of Caligula being summoned to the island of Capri, where Tiberius built a closed-off kingdom, full of books of philosophy, astronomical instruments, and whispers about games that servants only dared to mention in hushed tones in the dark. 6 years living there, Caligula learned a lesson no school could teach. Supreme power comes from fear, and human beings can transform into monsters if they believe themselves equal to the gods. Sound familiar? Just glance at a few modern headlines, and you will see that formula still works perfectly. The interesting part is that when Tiberius died, Caligula returned to Rome like a pop star. The people cheered, soldiers carved his name into their shields, and in that moment, the entire city felt reborn. Think of it like when a young soccer star is sent onto the field after years of the national team's decline, the whole nation ablaze with hope. But sadly, instead of bringing the golden goal, Caligula delivered own goals that no one could have imagined. Yes, if there were a ranking of cultural shocks in history, Caligula would surely take number 1. Sorry, Nero, you only get second place. In the first months, Caligula played the role of the virtuous ruler perfectly. He released political prisoners, honored those before him, and even handed out bonuses to the Praetorian Guard. The people sighed in relief. Ah, so it's not that bad. But you know, sometimes the scariest thing is not the sudden storm, but when it quietly builds in the air, until one night you realize your window panes are trembling. One night, Caligula told his courtiers that he dreamed Jupiter, Venus, and Diana came to speak with him, not in a pleading way, but as equals gods and emperor discussing true power. Imagine if you had a friend who claimed, "Yesterday I went for coffee with Zeus and Minerva. They told me to throw out all the rules." How would you react? You would probably laugh it off and think your friend was sleep-deprived. But in Rome, when the one saying that sat on the throne, every smile froze on every face. From dream to doctrine, Caligula declared himself a living god, and he began to act as if every moral boundary was just a game. Historians still debate, was that the sign of delusional madness or a calculated political strategy? Because if you look closely, every ritual he created had one thing in common, turning all who attended into accomplices. Once you are dragged into the mud, you no longer dare to criticize the one who pushed you down. I will pause a moment for you to picture the festival of Lupercalia under Caligula. In the old days, it was a spring celebration where priests ran around the city, lightly striking with goat skins to bless fertility. Rather fun, rather wholesome, and not unlike a mix between a marathon and a street festival. But under Caligula's hand, it turned into an inverted ritual, where gods and humans, families and bloodlines, were all thrown together in a shocking performance. And from that moment, the already blurred boundary between the sacred and the profane was officially erased. Try to hear the heartbeat of Rome at that time, both excited and uneasy, like a crowd standing before a great stage where the red curtain was about to be drawn. They thought they were about to see an epic play, but instead, Caligula led everyone into a theatre of inversion. After proclaiming himself a living god, he did not stop at words. In his second year of reign, Caligula began turning public festivals into stages for his bizarre ideas. One official historical event was the Saturnalia festival in December of the year 40. By tradition, it was the happiest time of the year, when slaves and masters switched roles, banquet tables were lively, and laughter echoed throughout Rome. But Caligula turned it into a week-long performance, where moral codes were torn apart. He forced senators, those once eloquent about honor and tradition, to take part in rituals so humiliating that just retelling them made them feel unworthy to step outside the hall again. A strange detail few people know. Caligula often wore the costumes of gods when presiding over ceremonies. At times he donned Venus's robe with silk dresses and glittering jewelry, sometimes the helmet of the war god Mars, or the robe of Jupiter as he sat on the throne. When people saw it, they were both dazzled and suspicious. Some whispered that he was not embodying the gods, but mocking them all. Historians still debate this point. Did Caligula truly believe he was a god? Or was he deliberately performing to test whether Rome would submit absolutely? Either way, the result was the same. Fear replaced all belief. You can imagine that feeling as similar to today, when a leader stands before the public, saying things so absurd they are hard to believe, yet the entire hall keeps clapping. People no longer know what is real and what is false. And it is in that very moment that power reaches its most dangerous level, when truth no longer has value, just a little joke. But if Caligula lived in modern times, he would probably be a social media star, with millions of followers, of course. Eventually his account would be banned for violating community standards. The climax of Caligula's tragedy was his relationship with his beloved sister Drusilla. This is a historical event that cannot be ignored. When Drusilla died in the year 38, Caligula deified her, built temples, and forced the people to worship her like Diana or Minerva. Rumor had it he even held necromantic rites, speaking with the spirit of Drusilla amid clouds of incense. And the strange part is that he ordered the citizens to mourn, as if all of Rome had lost its guardian goddess. An even more unbelievable detail. Some sources claim Caligula kept his sister's corpse in the palace to continue rituals. Historians still debate whether these accounts were exaggerated by political enemies, or whether Caligula truly slipped into a world where family ties, power, and fanaticism had no boundaries. Imagine the scene. Among gilded walls, where statues of the gods looked down, a young man once called Little Boots now sat dressed as a goddess, whispering to the shadow of his departed sister. Do you feel the shiver running down your spine? It was nothing less than a nightmare, one that even the toughest of the Praetorian Guard could no longer endure. And here, another secret was revealed. Cassius Chaerea, commander of the Guard, who had once sworn to protect the emperor with his own blood, began to gather a conspiracy. What is remarkable is that this plot was not born from a hunger for power. It was born from a shared disgust. They said to each other, "We cannot allow these rituals to continue. If we do, Rome will lose its very soul." And you know, when those who once lived by loyalty begin to doubt the very reason for their existence, the end is only a matter of time. Hearing this, does the scene feel familiar to you? It is like in a company, when employees no longer whisper about salaries or projects but begin to murmur, "We are being destroyed day by day." That is when collapse is near, even if the surface still shines. To put it lightly, Caligula was the worst CEO in human history, and yes, HR could not save this company either. What happened afterward, you will see, was not simply an assassination. It was the result of 4 years of suffocation, 4 years of living on a stage where shame became chains. Historians emphasize, Caligula ruled not only through fear, but also through humiliation, a weapon more sophisticated than any army, because it sealed the mouths of victims, turned them into accomplices, and ensured they would never dare lift their heads again. Take a deep breath. The story is not over. The fateful blades of night are yet to come. But before we enter them, remember this. What made Caligula the very symbol of corruption was not only his rituals, but the fact that he proved shame could be stronger than iron. You see, this story is not just a piece of chronicle. It is like a distorted mirror that history holds up for you. In it, you will see the hunger for power, the fear of being overthrown, and the calculations that make people willing to shatter every limit. And sometimes, looking at Caligula, you might feel, well, at least the office dramas you endure today are still far easier to breathe through. Honestly, no matter how toxic a team meeting gets, no one has ever asked you to set up a shrine for your coworker right in the middle of the office. You walk slowly into the narrow corridor beneath the palace, where the dim torchlight flickers against the cold stone slabs. The scent of incense lingers from the rituals of the night before, but tonight is not for gods or Caligula's performances. This is the night for blades hidden beneath armor. On the 24th of January in the year 41, Cassius Chaerea and his co-conspirators decided to strike. Not out of lust for power, they knew full well that rebellion could cost their families' lives, but because they felt that if this continued, Rome would no longer be Rome. Official history records, when Caligula stepped into the corridor, he had just returned from a private ceremony to honor Drusilla. The conspirators hid in the shadows, waiting for the moment he passed. Chaerea was the first to strike, his sword piercing straight into the emperor's chest. Then came a flurry of blows, 30 wounds in total, as if each member of the group needed to wash his soul with the emperor's blood. Yet there is a strange detail few mention. Caligula did not scream, did not beg. Some accounts say he let out a short laugh, as if unable to believe the tools he had used now dared to betray him. Others claim he managed only a muffled curse before collapsing. Historians still debate, was he truly so delusional that he believed himself immortal? Or did he simply die too quickly to react? But imagine, a man who had sown fear for 4 years, suddenly realizing that the real storm came from the most familiar faces. When he fell, the palace plunged into chaos. Servants scattered, guards hesitated whether to save their master or quietly pretend not to see. And then, when the conspirators stormed into Caligula's private chambers, they found things more chilling than the corpse itself. Scrolls of parchment recorded in detail the rituals, the names of participants, and even future plans. One passage made it clear. In the coming ceremonies, each noble family of Rome would be forced to take part, spreading humiliation like a plague. Imagine yourself as a senator, unrolling that parchment and seeing your daughter's name already written into the divine plan. Perhaps in that very moment, many of the assassins silently thanked Jupiter that they had struck in time. Another strange piece of information. When the new emperor Claudius came to power, he ordered most of those records to be burned. But a few fragments survived, hidden in private libraries or in the collections of curious scholars. And it is thanks to those fragments that posterity knows Caligula was not acting on whim. He had plans, logic, a strategy of using humiliation as chains. Sound familiar? In modern times, people call it weaponizing shame. A tactic you can sometimes still glimpse in politics, in the media, or even in daily life. And yes, if you have ever felt embarrassed because you were wrongly tagged in a Facebook photo from 10 years ago, then you have tasted a tiny drop of the weapon Caligula used to control an empire. After his death, Claudius tried to cleanse the palace. Incense was burned, holy water sprinkled, rituals performed to beg the gods to wash away the stain. But you know, Some stains are not on marble, but in collective memory. Historians still debate. Was Caligula truly insane? Or simply a cruel genius who knew how to use humiliation to control? But the result is clear. Rome was never the same again. Notice this. After Caligula, names like Nero, Commodus, Caracalla, all in some way borrowed from him. No one copied completely, but the flavor of inversion, of chaotic performance, still haunted the throne. The scariest thing is not that a madman once ruled, but that successors realized, there are methods which, though filthy, are effective. This is Caligula's true legacy. He proved that the boundary between the sacred and the depraved, between order and chaos, between human and monster, is thinner than we think. And if one person with enough power dares to step across, an entire civilization will tremble with them. Breathe slowly for a moment. Doesn't it feel like this story is not only of the past? It whispers to the present, reminding us that civilizations do not fall to those beyond the borders, but to a rotting conscience at the very heart of power. And when you turn off the lights, with only the hum of the fan remaining, let that question follow you into sleep. Are we truly different from the past, or only circling beneath a new dome? You sigh, and let the tale carry you back to Rome after Caligula's death. When the people heard the young emperor had been assassinated, they were both shocked and relieved. Some stood in the marketplace and shouted that the gods had finally shown mercy to Rome, while others whispered in alleyways that soon another Caligula would rise again. And you know, that reaction is much like ours today. When a chaotic era ends, people do not only rejoice, they also worry because history so often loves to repeat its joke. Claudius, the unwilling successor, sought to win back the trust of the people. He ordered the palace to be cleansed with holy water, summoned all the high priests to pray, as if a few buckets of water and some chants were enough to erase the stains left by his predecessor. But you and I both know, memory does not fade so easily. The humiliations Caligula had sown were etched into the very bones of those who once had to kneel. And that scar of the spirit, Rome carried for generations. There is a strange detail worth remembering. Many ancient sources say that the senators, though they hated Caligula, still did not dare openly criticize him even after his death. Why? Because they had once participated in his sacred rituals, once bowed before his deranged performances. If they spoke out, they would also be unmasking themselves. This was Caligula's cruel genius. He did not rule by fear alone, but by complicity. When you have been dragged into the mud, you no longer dare to scream, for the scream itself would expose you. Historians still debate whether this was calculated strategy or merely an unintended consequence. But the outcome is clear. Rome became more silent, more obedient, and more willing to accept the next cruelties. Think about it, doesn't it feel familiar? In modern life, sometimes you see an entire group fall silent before something wrong, not because they don't recognize it, but because each of them has already dipped their hands, in one way or another, into that wrong. And so silence becomes an invisible lock. If Caligula lived today, perhaps he would not need swords or armor, only a group chat and a few secrets stored on a cloud server, and that would be enough to rule a whole community. I'm joking, but you see, power built on shame never goes out of style. The most frightening part is that Caligula proved a civilization does not collapse because of enemies outside, but because of rot from within. The people of Rome later realized the battles at the borders, the foes from the north or the east, none were as dangerous as an emperor who knew how to turn humiliation into a weapon. And so, for centuries after, whenever a king or a ruler went too far, people whispered his name as a warning. Even the emperors who followed, like Nero or Commodus, were compared to Caligula. Though each had their own way of spreading chaos, the formula had already been left behind by him, erasing the boundary between sacred and profane, turning spectacle into politics, turning humiliation into a tool. And here, you might smile bitterly. Sometimes in history, it is the madman who leaves behind an innovation that ordinary men would never have conceived. You lie still, listening to the steady hum of the fan. This story, though nearly 2,000 years away from us, still echoes somewhere in today's life. You realize that the line between order and chaos, between civilization and corruption, is in truth very thin. It only takes one individual, with absolute power and enough audacity, daring to say, "The law does not apply to me." And just like that, everything you once trusted collapses in an instant. Perhaps that is Caligula's true legacy. Not the debaucheries inside his palace, but the cold lesson that civilization is always just one step away from the abyss. And as you dim the last of the lights, leaving only the gentle darkness in your room, remember, history never sleeps. It lies right beside your pillow, whispering that any society needs only one new Caligula to relive the nightmare. Picture Rome in the days after the assassination. A weary city, both relieved and unsettled. People whispered by the wells in taverns at the fish market. Is it really over? Or will he return, just as he once declared himself an immortal god? That fear lingered, like waking from a nightmare knowing you are awake, yet not daring to rise from bed. The strange part is that, though they hated Caligula, part of the populace longed for the chaos he brought. They said, at least when he lived, every day was a surprise. You never knew what the next morning would bring. Sound familiar? Sometimes in modern life, people too are addicted to chaos. A group that has grown accustomed to drama, when peace returns, suddenly feels empty, and that is the paradox. Evil leaves its mark not only through fear, but through an invisible addiction. Historians still argue over how much of the records about Caligula are true. Some say the Roman historians, senators who had once been humiliated by him, exaggerated to slander. Perhaps some rituals were embellished. Perhaps a few terrifying details were born of imagination. But even if they were, the fundamental truth does not change. Caligula wielded power like a surgeon's knife, cutting away the most sacred parts of society to prove that no limits existed. And that is what keeps his name alive longer than any rumor. Imagine this. 2,000 years later, we are still sitting here, in a quiet room, listening to his story. How many emperors have reigned? How many glorious victories have passed? And yet most have been swept away by time. And still, Caligula, a man who held power for less than 4 years, is remembered in history's restless dreams. Ironic, isn't it? Live gently and you are forgotten, but sow nightmares and your name becomes immortal. Indeed, history sometimes has its own dark sense of humor. One detail few notice. Many later philosophers saw Caligula as living proof of the saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely. But some scholars argued he was not insane, nor whimsical. They claimed Caligula was more like a social experimenter, determined to prove how easily humans would accept inversion. And frighteningly enough, that experiment was a spectacular success. The Romans, proud of their laws and morals, finally bowed to the performances of a young man in his 20s. Does that send a chill down your spine? If we stretch this thread into the present, perhaps you will realize something. In any society, there is always the risk of a new Caligula. Not necessarily someone dressed as the goddess Venus or forcing senators into bizarre rituals. Sometimes, it only takes someone who knows how to bend truth, weaponize shame, and convince the crowd that this is normal. And when that happens, history repeats itself under a different mask. You close your eyes, noticing the ceiling fan's steady hum, and consider, if there is any lesson from Caligula to carry into sleep, it is this civilization is not unshakable, but only a fragile thread. And sometimes, it takes just one reckless hand to snap it, and everything unravels into chaos. In your imagination, you open your eyes and see that centuries later his name is still whispered, not because people wish to honor him, but because the obsession with him lingers like a long shadow hiding behind every throne. In Roman and medieval art, painters often depicted Caligula with vacant, foolish eyes, as a warning to anyone who dreamed of unlimited power. By the Renaissance, when Europe was steeped in humanist thought, scholars used him as an example to argue that human beings, no matter their learning or talent, would be deformed if they placed themselves on equal footing with the gods. You see, Caligula did not only exist in history books, but became a symbol in painting, literature, and theatre. Here's an intriguing detail few know. Many classical plays in 17th-18th century Europe made Caligula their central character, but audiences did not attend merely to mock the past. They came to see reflections of their own time. Playwrights cleverly used Caligula's image to hint at their contemporary kings. It was like a game. Spectators sat on wooden benches, laughing at the mad Roman emperor, but inwardly thinking, the man on the throne outside is not so different. Historians still debate, was Caligula truly evil to the core? Or were the horrific stories only exaggerations by political enemies? Yet this very ambiguity is what makes him immortal. The real Caligula is long dead, but the imagined Caligula lives on, a figure that each generation gazes upon to ask, are we letting power slip from our grasp? Stepping into the 20th century, Caligula became a source of inspiration for literature and cinema. The philosopher Albert Camus wrote a play titled Caligula, portraying him as a man who realized the absurdity of life and decided to make that absurdity his law of rule. Reading that script, you see Caligula not only as a historical figure, but as a symbol of the absurdity of the human condition. And then, the modern world put him on screen. Many films depicted Caligula as deranged, depraved, while others painted him as a cruel genius. Either way, audiences left the theatre with the same feeling. The line between reason and madness is too thin, so thin that a single slip is enough. You might chuckle. If there were an Oscar for historical villainy, Caligula would have held it for 2,000 years. For every time he appears in paintings, in plays, in films, he makes people shiver. And strangely, shivering itself is addictive. We are afraid, but we still want to hear more, see more, learn more. To be honest, even you now are lying here, in quiet darkness, listening to me tell his story, aren't you? But at a deeper level, what keeps Caligula alive in humanity's memory is not the debauchery or the bizarre rituals. What truly makes us remember him is the question he left behind. What becomes of a civilization when its leader turns humiliation into a tool of rule? And this is a question without an expiration date. From Rome through the Middle Ages to the modern world, it still echoes in every parliament, every palace, every place where power is gathered. Listen for a moment. The fan still hums steadily. The city outside still sleeps. Yet this story reminds you that the sleep of civilization is always fragile. Tonight, Rome is silent, but one day, a new Caligula may step forward, not draped in Venus's robe, but in a modern suit, standing before a microphone and declaring, "I am the truth." And at that moment, the ancient tale becomes the present. You're still awake, aren't you? Then let's take another turn, not only through the marble corridors of the Roman palace, but also through the palaces of today, where fluorescent lights replace torches and microphones replace thrones. Imagine this. If Caligula lived in the 21st century, he would not need incense rituals or stone statues of gods. He would only need a live stream camera and a few million followers. Instead of forcing senators to kneel before Venus's altar, he could compel everyone to like and share under the banner of a social media challenge. And you know, the crowd would still join, because shame in the modern world is no weaker than in ancient Rome. It might even spread faster, just one click is enough. An official piece of history for you to remember. After Caligula was killed, Claudius succeeded him and tried to restore order. But the truth is, the wound Rome carried lasted for generations. And if you compare carefully, you will see, each time a modern leader uses fear or humiliation to bind a community, that is the legacy of Caligula reborn. Here's a strange detail. There are records claiming that Caligula once planned to build an entire floating bridge out of warships, just so he could ride his horse across it to prove that nothing is impossible. That idea, both absurd and childish, looks oddly familiar if you think about it. Haven't you seen someone today launch massive, unrealistic projects just to feed their colossal ego? And strangely enough, there is always a crowd that claps and cheers, for people are often drawn to those who dare to do the outrageous. Just joking, but honestly, Caligula may have been ahead of his time when it came to PR through madness. Historians still debate. Perhaps we remember Caligula not only because he was terrible, but because he was a magnified mirror of our own instincts. You look at him and realize that somewhere in every community, every organization, there is a bit of Caligula. One person testing the boundaries, a crowd accepting it, and then the whole group spiraling into a trap they cannot escape. And this is the point you need to take with you into tonight's sleep. Caligula is not an old story closed within textbooks. He is a reminder that the boundary between civilization and chaos is not a fortress wall, but a chalk line on the ground. All it takes is one powerful hand bold enough to wipe it away, and tomorrow you may wake to find yourself in an entirely different world. You see, it sounds frightening, but also a little ironic. For perhaps, somewhere, Caligula is smirking, seeing that 2,000 years later humanity still speaks his name as a warning to itself. And if he truly sat on some cloud above, he would probably whisper, "I have succeeded more than all others. Not thrones, not victories. It is shame that made my name immortal." You breathe deeply, hearing the steady hum of the fan, letting this story slowly dissolve into sleep. But before your eyes close, remember, the modern world, with all its technology, its laws, its civilization, is still only one Caligula away from Rome of old. You lie there, the light in the room dimming, the fan still turning, and the story refuses to leave you. So let me take you one step further, more slowly now, like footsteps echoing in the empty halls of the Palatine Palace. Imagine this. After Caligula's death, Rome outwardly returned to its old rhythm. The fish market bustled again, the arena reopened, soldiers drilled in the square. Yet inside each person, an invisible crack remained. They realized, if a man in his 20s could bend all of Roman morality in just 4 years, then anyone after him could too. And so, the name Caligula gradually became a psychological test, a memorable historical fact. Even decades later, Roman historians struggled when writing about him. Some chose the simple way, calling him mad. Others, braver, admitted he was intelligent and dangerous. And it was precisely this division that left posterity uneasy. Was he insane or a cruel genius? Historians still argue endlessly, and sometimes the questions without answers are the very ones that keep us awake. Here's a strange detail few mention. In some Roman temples centuries later, graffiti was found scrawled on the walls, reading, "Caligula lives." No one knows if it was the joke of poor citizens or a true obsession. Imagine walking past an old wall and seeing that phrase carved with a knife, as if a ghost still lingered somewhere nearby. Much like today, when you scroll online and still stumble upon bizarre conspiracy theories about powerful figures who never really died. And so, through the centuries, Caligula became a name invoked as a symbol. In philosophy, he was the example of corruption. In theatre, he was the central figure of dark tragedies. On film, he became a figure at once alluring and repulsive, making audiences shiver yet unable to look away. You see, sometimes the stories that unsettle us most are the ones that live the longest. A small joke. If Caligula had a YouTube channel, the algorithm would surely recommend his videos for 1,000 years straight. Modern scholars point to another aspect. Caligula has never been forgotten, because every society needs a ghost to look at itself. When the world grows too confident, people invoke his name to remind themselves that chaos is always waiting. And in a sense, Caligula succeeded beyond all expectation. He ruled Rome for only 4 years, but he has ruled the imagination of humanity for 2,000. Do you hear the whisper in the dark? It tells you that every society, no matter how radiant, stands only on a fragile thread. And whenever someone treads too heavily, the thread trembles, and all must hold their breath. Caligula once made that thread tremble, and posterity has never stopped peering down into the abyss. Now you take a deep breath. Your eyelids grow heavy, yet your mind still drifts along with the story. And that is the strangest thing of all. Caligula, long dead, still sits somewhere in your imagination, a shadowy figure both alien and familiar. Think of this. Caligula is not only the story of one man, but also a metaphor for the fragility of power and morality. When he turned shame into a weapon, he touched upon one of humanity's darkest secrets, that we fear dishonor more than death. And here lies the fascinating part. Other civilizations, too, have had their own Caligulas. In China, you might think of Qin Shi Huang, who burned books and buried scholars to prove that his power stood above knowledge itself. In Japan, there were shoguns who turned solemn rituals into spectacles of display to bind their retainers. In the Arab world, some caliphs once transformed their palaces into stages where divine authority and worldly power blurred together, leaving the people unsure of what was sacred and what was performance. And in distant America, the Aztecs carried out fiery blood rituals atop pyramids to affirm that the gods lived within human flesh. Historians still debate. Were these phenomena the inevitable result of absolute power, or merely coincidence? But whatever the answer, you can see the same pattern. When humans are granted authority beyond all limits, they often seek to break those limits to prove they are more than mortal. Here's another strange detail. In the 20th century, when psychologists studied the phenomenon of cult of personality in totalitarian regimes, they often used Caligula as a classical example, for he needed no military triumphs, no economic genius. He only needed to sow within the people a mixture of emotions, reverence, shame, and curiosity. And that mixture was the strongest chain of all. Sound familiar? Yes, because you've seen it many times, even in your own era. You might smile lightly. History does not repeat exactly, but it plants patterns for posterity to copy. Caligula is such a pattern, a mold ready, made for anyone who wishes to control the crowd not with whips, but with spectacle, with the turning of the sacred into vaudeville. If he lived today, perhaps Caligula would be a top reality show director. Too bad there was no Netflix in the 1st century after Christ. You see, once we expand beyond Rome, we realize Caligula is not only a Roman story, it is a global lesson. That every civilization stands before the temptation of giving too much power to one individual. And when that happens, decay does not come from outside, but from the very place once proud to be the center of morality. So imagine this. If tomorrow you opened the news and read about a leader declaring himself above the law, would it feel strange? Or would you smile and whisper softly, "Ah, just another Caligula"? You lie still, listening to the steady hum of the ceiling fan, and try to see Caligula not only through the eyes of a historian, but through the lens of modern psychology. Suddenly, he is no longer a distant emperor, but a vivid case study of narcissistic personality, of how power can inflate the ego until a man becomes a symbol of distortion itself. One official historical event is that Caligula openly declared himself a living god, forcing everyone to kneel as they would before Jupiter or Venus. From a psychological angle, that is a textbook sign of narcissistic grandiosity, the ego's mania for greatness. Therapists today would call it the illusion of absolute power, where the narcissist does not merely want to be loved, but to be worshipped. And in Caligula's case, the crowd actually complied. You see, this was not just an individual pathology, but a social effect. One person inflating the self, and an entire community colluding in that inflation. Here's a strange detail few mention. Caligula often staged rituals, not for simple indulgence, but to turn the powerful into accomplices. This tactic is strikingly close to what psychology now calls trauma bonding, when the narcissist both humiliates and grants favor, trapping victims in an emotional bind. Roman senators, once forced to take part, no longer dared resist, for deep down they knew that if the truth ever surfaced, their own honor would be shattered. Does that feel familiar? This is the same mechanism many modern victims of narcissists experience in personal relationships, hating the abuser, yet unable to leave, because shame has become an invisible chain. Historians and psychologists still debate, was Caligula truly insane, or simply an extreme narcissist who knew exactly what he was doing? Some argue that he calculated every step from making himself a god to humiliating the elites to build power that could not be undone. It sounds terrifying, but from a psychological view, it follows a familiar logic. The narcissist wants to ensure that no one can leave them without carrying a permanent stain. You might smile a little. If Caligula sat in a therapy chair today, the psychologist's notes would be full. Grandiose delusions, entitlement, lack of empathy, manipulative use of shame. And perhaps the session would end very quickly, because Caligula would almost certainly declare, "I am the doctor here, and you are merely the student." Yes, I joke, but you see clearly the scale of the narcissism. At a deeper level, Caligula's story reveals something else. Narcissism is not only an individual issue, but a social challenge. A common narcissist may destroy a family, but a narcissist on a throne can destabilize an entire civilization. Rome learned that lesson in blood, and humanity has perhaps never stopped confronting it. So when you hear modern terms like toxic leadership, gaslighting, or collective shame, remember that their earliest versions once played out under Roman torchlight, in marble corridors, where Caligula whispered that he was a god. And that lesson, 2,000 years later, remains intact. Once weaponized, shame can bind people more tightly than chains of iron. You close your eyes, letting your breath slow. History, psychology, and the story of Caligula merge together like a distant background score. And a question lingers, soft but insistent. Would you recognize a Caligula if he stepped into your world today? You still want to hear more, don't you? Then let's pull Caligula out of the ancient frame, placing him beside characters you know well from modern culture on screen, in novels, even in the series you once stayed up late to binge-watch. Notice how 20th, 21st century cinema is filled with villains who carry a hint of Caligula. They are not only violent, but know how to use shame and spectacle to control the crowd. For example, in many films about corporate empires, we see arrogant CEOs enter the boardroom as though stepping into a temple, forcing employees to clap endlessly for absurd decisions. That is the Caligula spirit, turning wrongdoing into ritual and turning complicity into the foundation of power. One official historical event recalls that Caligula once forced everyone to kneel before him as if he were the god Jupiter. Compare that carefully, and you will see the same image reborn in countless science fiction films. The dictator on his throne, with hundreds cheering below, even as they tremble inside. And there it is. Modern culture constantly borrows the Caligula template to portray narcissistic power. Here's a strange detail. In 20th century existentialist literature, the philosopher Camus wrote the play Caligula and described him as a man who discovered the absurdity of life, then used that absurdity as the law of his reign. That interpretation shaped cinema afterward, from villains in film noir to crime lords in mafia films. You see, Caligula is like a strand of cultural DNA, woven through every villain we know today. Historians and cultural critics still argue, does comparing Caligula with fictional characters dilute history? But in reality, it is this very crossover that keeps him alive in collective imagination. No one remembers a dry statistic, but everyone remembers a compelling villain. And Caligula, unwittingly, became the archetype for that kind of character. Think of superhero films, where villains often want not only to dominate the world, but to prove, I am beyond human law. Isn't that an echo from a Roman palace? Or in dystopian novels, where leaders force citizens into bizarre, collective rituals, you will glimpse Caligula's shadow on every page. A small joke. If Hollywood held a casting call for a narcissistic villain, both alluring and terrifying, Caligula would land the lead role instantly. No audition needed. After all, he performed it in real life, with all of Rome as his unwilling audience. And here lies the real point. Modern culture borrows Caligula's image not only to frighten, but to remind us that narcissistic power does not belong to any one age. It can wear a crown, a business suit, appear on a film set or in a boardroom, but the common thread never changes, turning shame into chains, turning the crowd into spectators of a show they dare not leave. You hear the low hum of the fan in the quiet room and smile softly. Perhaps you realize, every time you watch a film with a villain both deranged and magnetic, you are meeting Caligula again, in a new guise, yet still the same. And that is why his name has never vanished from human imagination. You're not ready to sleep yet, are you? Then let's step one layer deeper, where Caligula appears not just as a young emperor, but as a psychological symbol, an archetype in Carl Jung's sense, the embodiment of the shadow, the darkness that every civilization carries within itself. One official historical fact: Caligula reigned for less than 4 years, yet left a deeper imprint than many emperors who ruled for decades. This has drawn special attention from psychoanalysts and modern philosophers, because he was not just a man, but a mirror of projection. Rome looked at him and saw what it always tried to hide: desire, cruelty, shame. Here's a strange detail few notice. Many sources record that Caligula often staged rituals beneath colossal statues of the gods, so that participants could no longer distinguish where divinity ended and the emperor began. This was a perfect psychological performance. He stepped into the role of the community's shadow and forced them to play along. By participating, they too became complicit, and that collective darkness only grew larger. Historians still debate, was Caligula truly mad, or did he deliberately play the role of the monster that Rome's unconscious had created? But through Jung's eyes, we might say, Caligula was the shadow of the Roman Empire, where military power, discipline, and strict law marched alongside the craving to shatter every limit. He did not create the darkness, he dragged it into the light in the most terrifying way. Think of it in the modern world. Every community has its hidden shadow, the things no one wants to admit. But sometimes, an individual appears who dares to speak aloud, to act out what others secretly think. And when that happens, the community feels both outraged and mesmerized. Caligula is the perfect example. Hated, yet haunting. They killed him, but they whispered his name for centuries. You might smile bitterly. If Rome were a patient on a therapy couch, Caligula was the nightmare dream Jung would point to and say, "This is your shadow. You must face it." And Rome could not bear the dream, so they stabbed him 30 times to erase it. But like every repressed dream, it never disappeared. It returned, in Nero, in Commodus, and in countless other shadows. A light joke. If there had been a shadow analysis app in ancient Rome, the report would have flashed bright red. High-risk Caligula has exceeded safe limits. But 2,000 years ago, there was no app to send warnings. And so, the empire had to learn this lesson in the most painful way. You take a long breath and realize, the story of Caligula is not just about the past. It reminds us that darkness never disappears, it only waits for its chance to step out. And sometimes, that darkness wears a face frighteningly familiar. You lie still, listening to the low hum of the fan in the dark room, and let your mind settle. Now, imagine Caligula no longer standing on a throne, but stepping out of the history books to sit right beside you not as an emperor, but as a tiny mirror. When you look into it, do you see anything familiar? One official historical fact. Caligula once forced the entire Roman Senate to kneel before him as a living god. But look deeper, and you see, he only did what many secretly dream of, to have the whole world bow in recognition. His difference was that he had the power to make that dream real. And that is what chills us. In the shadow of every person lies a seed like that. Here's a strange detail rarely mentioned. As a child, Caligula was adored by soldiers who nicknamed him Little Boots. That boy was once innocent, once pure, and yet when he grew up, that affection turned into a thirst for power. Historians still debate. Was he born twisted, or did childhood experiences bend his path? But through Jung's lens we might say, the brighter the light, the longer the shadow. Now connect this to yourself. Have you ever felt a fleeting, dangerous thought, if only everyone did as I say? Or a moment when you made someone feel small and realized that for an instant you felt powerful? That is the little Caligula inside you the shadow Jung spoke of. It does not make you a monster, unless you deny it and let it take control. A small joke to ease the weight. If each of us carries a little Caligula within, then perhaps this world is one giant, miniature Rome. Luckily, most of the time, your little Caligula only shows up when fighting over the TV remote, not the throne. And here is what matters. Instead of denying it, you need to look straight at that darkness, and only then will it stop ruling you. Caligula became Rome's nightmare because he never admitted he was only human. But you, by recognizing the shadow within yourself, have already gone 1,000 light years beyond him. You take a deep breath, letting it reach your chest. This story, about a Roman emperor, suddenly becomes a story about you. A reminder that in every step of daily life, you can choose to let little Caligula take control, or let gentle light lead the way. And the very fact that you are here, listening and reflecting, is proof that you choose the light. All right, since you don't want to end just yet, let's go a little further, softly, like lighting a small candle in a dark room. Imagine Rome after all those storms. The squares that once roared with noise now lie silent. The marble statues still stand, but their cold stone eyes are no longer turned into props for a performance. At night, the wind blows across the Palatine Hill, carrying whispers of the past, like a reminder, there was once a Caligula here, and Rome survived. One official historical fact. Immediately after the assassination, Caligula's body was buried in haste, only to be dug up again and burned, to erase his trace. The act itself was like an exorcism ritual, and yet, even though his body was destroyed, the name Caligula remained, a warning that could not be burned away. Here's a strange detail. Records say that for years, people avoided speaking his name directly and instead referred to him obliquely as the Mad Emperor. They believed that just saying his true name might be enough to summon his spirit back. And you see, that is the power of darkness. It doesn't need to exist in flesh. Memory alone is enough to make us shiver. Historians still debate. Was this fear because Caligula was truly that horrific? Or because people could not bear to face the fact that they themselves had once knelt before him? Now bring it back to yourself. In life, there are memories you too may want to bury, but the more you try to cover them, the more they whisper in your sleep. Perhaps that is why, when we tell Caligula's story, we don't just hear his tale, we also hear echoes from within ourselves. And then, you lie still, noticing your eyelids grow heavy. The sounds in the room fade into the distance. Caligula's story, though filled with shadow, now drifts like a thin mist out of your mind. You no longer need to hold on to the details. What remains is only the gentle lesson that darkness always exists, but we can choose to face it instead of letting it consume us. Just a small joke before you drift into dreams. If Caligula were alive and saw you using his story to lull people to sleep, he would surely be furious. A man who once made an entire empire tremble would now be turned into a sedative. But that is also your victory. You have transformed the obsession into a gentle dream. Now relax. Rome has turned out the lights. History closes like a book set upon a table. You are left only with slow breaths, an even heartbeat, and peaceful darkness. Let yourself sink down, let sleep carry you far away, to a place with no thrones, no phantoms, only soft stillness all around. Wishing you a very peaceful night. Let the day's noise close like old wooden doors, leaving only the whisper of the fan and steady breathing. Tonight, you need not struggle or fight anything. Let your mind drift slowly, like a quiet river under the moon. When you wake tomorrow, you will feel lighter, more at peace. Sleep well, and dream gentle dreams.